So, welcome to the fourth day of the 13th meeting of Studies on the Origins of Contemporary Philosophy. Today, we have Professor Mark Textor, who will give us a talk. He's professor at the University London's King's College London. And after the presentation, Professor André Leclerc, which the camera is not showing right now, but okay, Professor André Leclerc, who is professor at the University of Brasilia, will make some comments and discuss Mark Textor's presentation with him. So without further ado, Professor Mark Textor, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invite and a big hello to Brazil. And I just get going. It's my slide. No, it doesn't work. It works. Very good. Okay, so you will already have known the title, Attention and the Appearance of Unity. So I won't stick around with that. Here's the plan of the talk, or maybe I paraphrase the kind of very general topic again. So in traditional philosophical terminology, there's always the distinction between the many and the one. Yeah, you find that from Greek philosophy up to, Peter van Inwagen's paper about when objects are parts starts with this question. What is the relation between many things and one thing which they may form, they may compose, as the terminology is? And that's the question which animates a lot of philosophy. Think about Kant on the synthetic unity of perception. Unity, oneness is a big topic there. And maybe think of idealistic thinkers like Bradley. They think the universe is a big unity. So it's a really core philosophical topic. And what I want to do in the talk, I will talk about late 19th, early 20th century philosophers who think there's no such thing. It's never the case that the many compose a one. I will call this view Mereological illusionism, and I will tie it in the first part of the talk, the thing which I label here under one, to a German philosopher, Hermann Lotze, which is currently not that much discussed and known, but he was a big star between 1880 and 1925, and I will document his influence a bit. Then, second thing I will do is I will distinguish between mereological illusionism and mereological idealism. Important distinction. And I should say to that at the moment, mereological idealism is on the rise. So some people will take interest in that, I think. Then, mereological illusionism says there's something like an appearance of unity. And I will explain and motivate that, what that means and why one should believe in that, by looking at a prima facie plausible slogan. One can only attend to one thing at a time. And you already see, yes, that it's one thing is somehow tied to attention, simultaneous attention, and I will somehow belabor that connection a bit. And then I will try to explain the connection between attention and oneness a bit further by looking at the connection between attention and interest. And that's something which I will do primarily by looking at the work of George Frederick Stout. And finally, as you do, I will go on and criticize Kant on the basis of what has been said before. Okay, so this is in a way a historical talk because a lot of dead philosophers figure in it. And I take them as making a contribution to the development of philosophical views which are temporal, which have appeal independently of a particular historical setting. So it would be good to have an overview of which positions are on offer and which one is the one which is explored here further. So if you think about the relation between the many and the one, people say common sense. That's when we are on the club of omnibus or on the tube. If you ask people, you say, of course. I mean, there is the many trees and the one forest. There are the many stars and the one galaxy. And if that's paired with the idea that the one forest, the one galaxy is distinct from the trees, the stars, and so on, a distinct object, which is co-located with all of them, but distinct, then you could say that's the common, according to the people I'm discussing, that's the common sense view of composition. Yeah? Sometimes there is a big thing in addition to all the small things, which is composed from them, distinct from them, but it's still a physical object which is where they are. Yeah. And if you say that it's not like everything composes with everything else, every physical object composes with everything else, they're kind of selective principles which tell you which things form additional wholes together. Usually that's tried to make clear by saying that some relations, some multivariate relations between the many turn the many into one. Not all, but some do. Distinct from common sense is the view that, well, any objects, there's no restriction. Any objects compose a mereological sum that has them and only them as parts. The Eiffel Tower and my right earlobe, they form a mereological sum. Anything whatsoever. Here the question is whether the mereological sum is really that thing which the common sense people have in mind, or whether this kind of very generous view is just a reflection of a mereological sum being kind of a logician's invention. Then we come closer to the views I'm interested in. So nihilists say composition never helps. Yeah. So there are only many things, but they never come together to a further big thing which has them as parts. The kind of, I think, very honest and clear view is eliminativism. It says there are simply no big things. There are no wholes composed of parts. And there's a kind of compromise view. We say, I can see that common sense deals in these wholes, galaxies, forests, and so on. But let's give them something. And what we would say is what's happening there is strictly speaking, scientifically, philosophically informed. We should say there are no wholes. But for some purposes, it's kind of good to make believe as if there were wholes. I think a bit of the Wagner terminology. We do as if there are wholes. We make believe that there are. That's, for instance, the position which is advocated in a very influential paper by C.N. Doerr and Gideon Rosen, which is I think called mereological fictionalism. Unfortunately, this program has now somehow changed my formatting a bit, but I hope it will not be too bad. So here now you can say, okay, fictionalism. It says, well, there are no wholes, but it's some kind of make-believe or fiction. And you ask yourself, why do we have this fiction? And I think Leibniz is one of the first mereological fictionalists. Yeah, I'll read to you that quote. I won't read all the quotes, but I will read that one. So because it brings in a lot of topics I'm interested in. Yeah. So Leibniz says our mind notices and conceives some genuine substances that have certain modes. These modes contain relations to other substances. From this, the mind takes occasion to join them together in thought, and to put one name in the counting of all these things together, which serves for convenience in reasoning. But one must not let oneself be deceived thereby into making of them so many substance or truly real beings. That is only for those who stop at appearances. So here you get some kind of development of fictionalism. They are just the simples, the genuine substances. Then there's the mind, and the mind finds it somehow convenient to put some of the many under one name. It's supposed to be somehow good for reasoning. It's not really. I mean, you might just save your breath instead of saying John, Ted, Fred, and so on and so forth, by just saying whatever the Smiths or Radiohead. So there's something like it saves you breath, it saves you ink. Therefore, we have names which are syntactically simple. There's no sign that they refer to, or syntactically singular. That's the more important. They're syntactically singular, but they seem to refer to many. So an example is Radiohead. You can say Radiohead is the most influential, what are they, indie group of the last 20 years. Radiohead is in the singular, but you could also say Radiohead are playing at the Reading Festival. There you have plural. And what people like Leibniz suggest is that we're taken in somehow by these grammatical appearances. And when we're taken in by the grammatical appearances, we somehow reify them and think Radiohead stands for one thing, while it really refers to I think 5. So that's one account of where does this fiction come from? Why is it useful? What I'm not will now discuss this in that much detail, but it's a kind of intellectualistic account of where this fiction comes from, namely convenience in reasoning, convenience in talking about the world. And you might think, well, if you have now educated people properly, and they have read whatever the work of Rosen and Dorr about mereology, they would think, okay, let's revise this. The people I will be mainly interested in, which I will now bring to you in the next 20-30 minutes, say that's not right. It's not an intellectualist mistake. It's not a mistake in which is engendered by ease of reasoning. It's much more fundamental. It has to do with perception and attention. So what I'm proposing is, or at least let me put it, what the people I will be discussing propose is that there's a form of perceptual error, or better, not even better, an error is engendered by attention. Because attention is something which you cannot, it's a very fundamental operation. You cannot get rid of it. Well, here's the first. So here's something like the father of these guys, the spiritual director of mereological illusionism, as I will call this position. And again, I'm sorry that some of the formatting goes when I put this into this format, into the SteamYard slideshow. It's still okay. So I could say a lot about Lotze. I won't do that. I will just say he's started out as a German physiologist and then became a very influential philosopher of mind, metaphysician, who was a big inspiration for British idealists, British philosophers of mind, and American pragmatists. And that I say that, and you will see in a couple of slides why that is so and how this comes about. And one of the things which is really influential is this idea about illusionism. So here's the first quote, and there's not much of an argument against the idea that there are these additional holes, but I just put it for as an example where you get an idea of the position. So Lotze discusses the view discusses mechanistic explanations, and he asks himself, look, sometimes you have some atoms, and so the atoms are the many. These atoms have powers, and there are many powers. And these powers may interact, and they may have one effect. And then he asks himself, if there's one effect which if the many somehow act in concert, produce, do we have an additional whole then? And his answer is no. I mean, if another illustration is helpful, think about a film crew, yeah? Tom, Ted, and Maria, they have all their talents, they pool their talents to produce one film. Is there then Tom, Dick, and Maria and the film crew? Are they unified in virtue of bringing about this effect? Well, I can talk that way, but is it, so to say, is there really that additional big thing? And the Lotze answer is no. Yeah? For the whole of this manifold of atoms, go back to the atoms, there's only one place where it is real as a unity, the embracing presentation of this observer. It's not terribly well put, I think. Yeah? But if there's something which is only real in the embracing presentation of an observer in one mind, then it's not real. So if I say, look, your win in the next marathon is only real in your mind. I say you haven't won the marathon, or you won't win it. It's just a figment of your mind. And he introduces here the idea that what we need to think of something as a unity is an embracing presentation of an observer. That's now unpacked over the next years in writers like William James. Yeah. So here's something which James called Lotze's law. And unfortunately, it's not a law. I mean, it's not like a general statement of a universalization over something. I think what James calls Lotze's law is the following claim, yeah. Unity, this oneness, this property, is not a property like mass, a plural property that some things together have. Unity is a relation between a plurality and a spectator. And William James, this is from the Principles of Psychology, first volume, it's very clear that that's something he finds in Lotze. Lotze has set forth the truth of this law more clearly and copiously than any other writer. Unfortunately, he's too lengthy to quote. I have great sympathies with this. Unfortunately, it's too lengthy to quote, but I will give you some quotes, and maybe then you will see why he says that. A couple of illustrations of Lotze's law. Yeah? So here's William James in a later work, the knowing of some things together. In physical nature, it is universally agreed a multitude of facts always remain the multitude. Yeah? The many become never one. The multitude remains the multitude they were, and appear as one fact only when a mind comes upon the scene and so views them, as when H2O appear as water to a human spectator. Yeah, so you get all these lots of ideas there. You need a spectator. Spectator better than mind, yeah, to which something appears as a unity. But in physical nature, there are only the many. Here's Josiah Royce, he's a rough contemporary of William James, but over more, and they both have a lot of interaction. Royce was actually a student in an extended sense of, Royce went to Göttingen to study with Lotze. I don't think that Lotze has actually supervised him in some way, but Royce frequently says, Lotze greatly influenced me, but he never quotes Lotze and he never refers to Lotze, a little bit annoying. But here's a nice rendering of the idea, which is very difficult for me to read because I saw it on the slide now. Okay, I'll read this also. So there are many senses in which various phenomena of nature occurring outside of our minds may be regarded as forming a unity. Once we speak of one forest, one range of mountains, or of one ocean, in a similar way, each thing in the physical world is regarded as, in some sense, a unity of many properties and states. Yet in all such cases, the sense in which we speak of the physical object as one or as many seems somewhat arbitrary and changes with our own point of view as external observers of a fact. And then he goes into something more linguistically fictionalist. Yeah, we sometimes say that the word forest is merely a collective name for the many trees, or even that the term thing stands for the collection of physical facts and processes, which our subjective interests unify, which in themselves are so many distinct facts. So again, the same topic, yeah, so in themselves, the various phenomena of nature are many. There is no unity. Then you got a bit of a kind of appeal to the Leibnizian linguistic fictionalism story. But then the observer enters the picture, yeah. There's something like a viewpoint relativity of unity and manifoldness. And that's again this idea which we get from Lotze. There's an important addition which I will later come back to, is something where I wish our subjective interest unify. So as part of the story is something about subjective interest, and that will later become important. Another one. Now we got an Englishman, James Watt. James Watt was also a student of Lotze, and he had much more contact with Lotze. He regularly went to visit him, and I actually looked at James Watt's intellectual biography, where the biographer calls him Lotze, the master of James Watt. And Watt himself said there are two people who made me what I am, Henry Sidgwick and Hermann Lotze. I won't read this again completely, but here you get exactly the same story. And Watt and Royce use very similar examples. Those basic stories, look, if you look around in nature, everything is a unity and a many. If you ask me what is this thing? Is this cup a many or is it a one? No answer to that. It's only relative to a subject that we can give an answer like yes or no. And that's now illustrated with this nice example, which you find in an earlier paper also by Royce. As you can see, for the flea on top of the dog is a many. It's a moving jungle or something. Moving many things, moving. However, I find it quite difficult to put myself at the standpoint of a flea, but I think that's what I would say. All this stuff here, wow. Let's get something to eat. Well, for us, it's the one. And for us, then, whatever the earth is a many. And for people who view it from space, it's perhaps a one. So it's relativity to the standpoint of an observer. Why is that? Okay, before I answer that question, let me draw a distinction and somehow illuminate or explain this idea a bit more. So illusionism is not the view, it's not a view about composition at all, or it's a view about composition insofar as they say, at least with respect to nature, there are no unities. Composition never happens. There are just the many. But there is a kind of persistent illusion that under some conditions, some objects appear together as one to a perceiver. And that can happen too if you change the perceivers or the conditions of perceiving. The same thing might be a unity for one and not for another, and so on and so forth. That's miles away from something which is called mereological idealism. And I was surprised, and philosophy is full of surprises, that mereological idealism has a comeback. So one of Peter's colleagues called, I've forgotten the first name, his last name is Pierce, has written a paper called Mereological Idealism, in which he defends mereological idealism. And here is what mereological idealism says: when a mind has a unified representation that is of or about many objects, I say that those objects are co-apprehended by that mind in that representation. According to mereological idealism, it is the co-apprehension of the desk parts under the concept desk that is responsible for the existence of the desk. So it's actually you who make desks by, who compose things by thinking of them, thinking of their parts together. I think that this idea about thinking of parts together is very important. So thinking that there's something like being conscious of many things together, that's important. But I have not gone into a great argument against this or so, but I find it somehow unbelievable that that brings about composition. That in virtue of my co-apprehending some things together, I don't think actually we need a concept to it, but he thinks we need a concept, that they come together to a desk. There's a desk in virtue of my thinking. I think that's rather too flattering view of my mind. So I will set this aside. But if you want to come back and talk about this in the discussion period, that's fine. It's something which people find now more and more plausible. I mean, Russell is a kind of limited mereological idealist because he thinks that my power of judgment, my judging, is a multiple relation. And if this multiple relation obtains between different things, then there is an additional complex. And that complex can be evaluated in terms of truth and falsity. Or Michael Jubian, who follows Russell in this respect. There are lots of people who think that propositions are somehow things whose existence depends on mental acts now. And one form, Uri Kriegel has a paper with a kind of telling title called Composition as a Secondary Quality, where also this is laid out, proposed as a view about composition, and things really compose wholes. Illusionism isn't. Illusionism is just saying that sometimes we cannot but think of things as one, also they are not one. That's why it's an illusion. So at least there's no mysterious power of the mind in illusionism. Okay, so what illusionists need to do is, I mean, illusionism is a kind of error theory. It's a non-intellectualist error theory about why we think there are unities, why we think there are wholes, why common sense deals in these additional unities. So what we need to explain is what is an appearance of unity, And why is it in certain circumstances inescapable? Okay, so part of this explanation is, if I go back now to Lotze, that some things are apprehended in one consciousness. That, maybe I read to you this quote and you see how difficult Lotze is. And you get the basic idea. So here's that's a quote from Lotze's Microcosmos. All the operations of a connected plurality either remain a plurality of separate operations or become truly fused into one only when they are transferred to the unity of a being as it states. Of consciousness, we can say that as the activity of an indivisible being, it does render possible the composition of the many into one, but that the unity of consciousness never can spring solely from the mutual action of the many. Ooh, it's not like stepping into a brightly lit room when you read this. So I understand. There are parts of it in which he seems to be a mereological idealist, yeah. Render possible the composition of the many into one. In other parts, he thinks that never happens. But they already render the composition of the many into one when the many are transferred to the unity of a being as it states. I think what he says, and we might discuss this more, is that there's a particular kind of unity, which is maybe it's a unity, maybe it's not a unity, consciousness. Yeah, we talk about the unity of consciousness. And if you would read more of the Royce quote, he would say, look, there are lots of arbitrary unities in nature, where we can think of the unity of the many. But there's exactly one, so to say, true unity, which is the unity of consciousness. That's not arbitrary. That's not somehow dependent on interests or conventions or anything like that. That's a sort of the fundamental unity. And that unity, if you talk of it as a unity at all, it's not something which is due to many things composing. Yeah? The unity of consciousness never can spring solely from the mutual action of the many. So many things working together will never give you something like a unity of consciousness. It's a fundamental unity. And part of what it is for some things to appear as a unity is for them to apprehend it together in one consciousness. And there's a lot of theory behind this. I won't go into that. You can think of this in more of a term of an example. Think of, I mean, this is a kind of necessary condition, yeah, that these things are apprehended in one consciousness. Think of corgis, lots of corgis in the park running around, or if you want other dogs, put the corgis in honor of the Queen. They're running around the park, and you listen to Beyonce's last album. If you want, I can play you some of it now, but maybe it's too distracting. There's lots of things going on at one time in one consciousness. But that might be a necessary condition for some things to appear as a unity, but it's not a sufficient condition. Something needs to be added to that. Yeah? What do we need to add to things in one consciousness, things being thought or co-apprehended, to get them appearing as one thing? And here's the answer. It is attention to them. It's quite difficult. I mean, it's not, as I said, I will tie this back to Lotze again. But as I said, Ward is Lotze is Ward's master, and Ward says that kind of clearly, not perfectly clearly. Here is the idea. It is used to be argued that we can only attend to one thing at once, but this is only true if it be understood to mean that a plurality of presentations to which attention is directed or on which is concentrated thereby tends to become a unity. And now he throws a lot of Kantian terminology at it, to be more or less definitely synthesized or integrated as one situation or one complex whole of some sort. So there are lots of things to be said about this. It's not really clear to me whether, okay, I say minor point of criticism. I think there's a valuable thought there, and it's one which Lotze has prepared, which needs to be massaged in the right form. But it's not clear whether what is synthesized. Is it the many presentations become one presentation? He talks, many presentations are not one situation, and that doesn't sound right. And he talks as if it's not the presentation, he talks as if he's a mereological idealist. Yeah, so there's this power of attention, and this power of attention is what composes things. Yeah, what makes many into one, what brings about a tendency that many become one. I think that's not ideal. That's not what he should say, and that's not what Lotze would say. But the basic thought is still that we can somehow learn from the slogan. We can only attend to one thing at once. What it takes for many things to appear as one thing. And I simplify this now, or maybe extract from this the following idea, which I think is really in Lotze, as we will see. So some things appear together as one, or appear as part of one unity, to someone, to some observer, if that observer perceptually attends to them together. And from that, it follows that these are in one consciousness. And all the work is done here by attention. So one important bit is here, so think of it like that. So there's this slogan, which every 19th century, late 19th century philosopher in the orbit, in the intellectual orbit of Lotze will somehow, at some point, pronounce and discuss. One can only attend to one thing at a time. You can somehow use that in two directions. You can think of, okay, I know what it is to be one thing, and now I use that to shed light on attention. I think in these guys, the direction of travel is the other way around. They say, well, we know what it is to attend. We can give you a story about attention. And from that, it will follow. Or on the basis of that story, we can illuminate what it is. Okay, someone maybe say what it is to be one thing, and others will maybe say what it is for some things to appear as one thing. Yeah. So this is a very important point, and you need to think, why would I buy that story at all? So Lotze, in an early work in which he somehow has outlined that, says, yeah, because he talks about movements of attention or mental movements. They, if you would perform different movements of attention at the same time, they would disturb each other. And I mean, the mind or whatever is not like a room in which only 5 people can be, or in which only 3 people can perform movements. So what imposes the limitation? It's not really clear, limitation that brings about that simultaneous things disturb each other. Quite a lot later, Bradley, he was also a great Lotze reader, in a paper on attention, says, well, beings that divide their attention tend to perish. You know, think of a rabbit. It might have the need to eat something, to drink something, and to escape the fox. And if it tries to do so that attentively all 3 things at the same time, it will perish, because it will achieve neither of these goals, because it does everything just imperfectly. Yeah. So here's the question: is again, why if this is a kind of evolutionary story, why doesn't evolution prefer the multitaskers, the people who can divide their attention a little bit? They get, so to say, the benefits and reproduce. So why don't we have a very strong attention capacity? What, again, the question is, what is imposed the limitation? So my former colleague Brian O'Shaughnessy spends in his book On the Will quite a lot of time discussing this, and he calls explanations as the ones given by Lotze and Bradley simply the quantitative explanation of finds and wanting. I think that's right. And he thinks it's just the basic truth about what a person is. So the tautology is a basic truth which has no further ground, that one person can only fully orient itself in one direction. I think that's somehow right. They're not somehow. I think that's right. It's a fundamental truth. There is no further argument for it. You might think, if you need to convince yourself of it, just think of a situation in which you have to do suddenly 5 things at once. The kettle is boiling, the postman is at the door, you need to finish an application, and it's all at the same time. The result is not that you will divide your attention and do everything a little bit. The result is that you will do none of it, and you will have a kind of mind freeze. And William James has a couple of pages on the situation where it says, so the opposite of directed attention is distraction, dispersion, and because he thinks things become clear if you see it in German, Zerstreutheit. And when you're zerstreut in this way, nothing happens, and the only thing you register is the passing of time. You become unparalyzed, you get going, if you can bring all these different things under one heading. There's a kind of unity there. If you have one plan in which you get this going. You might think there are exceptions, driving and talking. I'm very bad at driving. I've been taking driving lessons for years. I can tell you that if I had a driving instructor who talked a lot to me, my driving really suffered. So that doesn't. You can do several things at once. If one of them or some of them you can do mindlessly, but otherwise, I think I would side with O'Shaughnessy. This is kind of fundamental truth about thinkers, maybe. Okay, so we have now the idea that you can only do one thing at a time, but sometimes it's pressing upon you that you need to attend to several things, and now Lotze comes again in. I think this is a really tremendously influential idea. How do you do it? What would it mean to attend to several things? And Lotze has the following idea. Again, I read it to you. If we think the manifold in some dramatic relation to each other, its incorporation into this mutual unity allows us simultaneous overview. It is not achievable to present a snake and a lion simultaneously. This would require that our fantasy made 2 distinct reconstructing movements that constantly interfere at the same time. Yet the fight between them, pictured there, the lion and the snake, we can present also our attention when it wanted to move from the fight to the figure of the fighters, would also move here from one to the other. So what is the trick? So here's what we cannot do. What we have kind of first person evidence that we cannot do. We cannot at the same time fully attend to A and fully attend to B. But Lotze says, well, here's what we can do. We can fully attend to A related to B. So you cannot fully attend to the snake and you cannot fully attend to the lion, but you can fully attend to the fight between the lion and the snake. The fight between the lion and the snake is conceived of as a relation between the lion and the snake. And here we have now an introduction of what it is for some things to appear as a unity. Attending to them, plurally, requires one attending to them as related, to a relation between them. And if you have that, if you attend, so say, in one movement of attention to a relation between some things, then they appear to you as a unity. They appear to you as parts, as relata of one thing. Well, that's the explanation. And it comes out of the nature of attention. Attention cannot be factorized, so at least at a time, factorized in different movements of attention directed each on one object. We have one movement of attention directed to, I always said complex object, to a relation between things. Strangely enough, now the heading has been reduced to basically nothing, but let me introduce this otherwise then. You might think that sounds now like there's the mind plays a trick on it. Yeah, it wants to attend to the lion and the snake, and now it conjures up a dramatic relation. I don't know why it needs to be a dramatic relation between the lion and the snake, a fight, and then you can attend to them. But that's, I think, not really the idea. So let me try to make that a bit clearer and give kind of arguments for that. So basically, Lotze was interested in this idea for not that much. He somehow put it into, articulated it once, and then did not dwell that much on it. But you can find it in lots of people run now with this idea and try to argue for it, spin it out, make it not plausible. And the person who did most of this, and I think I would say almost all his philosophy is built around the idea that one can only attend to one thing at a time in the right understanding of one thing, namely things connected to each other, is a student of James Watt, George Frederick Stout, who was the first wild reader of mental philosophy in Oxford, and then became professor in St. Andrews, I think. So I think his work is very interesting, and is kind of detailed working out of lots of things Lotze merely suggested. And he is Stout trying to say more, giving a kind of further rationale for the idea that, yes, you can attend to some things, but only if they're connected. So I read to you the quote, the same attention process can only be simultaneously concerned with a plurality of different objects if the different objects are, now, yes, Stout, are thought of in some way connected with each other. For the unity of the attention process is the unity of interest, and unity of interest exists only insofar as we are and continue to be interested in the same objects. Okay, so we got a new thing here. So we got, first of all, we just had attention at one time, one thing, if these things are, the one thing can be many things, but they need to be related. That's what is, then these things appear to you as a unity. Now we get interest. And you already saw interest plays a role in Royce. Yeah, interest, subjective interest, unifying. What are interests? Interests are interests. Think about it. I'm interested in American football. I'm not interested. I'm interested in vintage watches. I'm interested in good food. Yeah, leave it at the intuitive level. It's a kind of, I think that's will suffice for our discussion. The way this is written, it sounds like, well, okay, so when do we have one attention process? If the process is somehow in the service of one and the same interest, and then you got interest give you many objects, then you have just shifted the problem or shifted the explanatory task to interest. Why can't interest now? Why can't you just be interested? Why can you be interested in many objects at the same time? I think that's actually not what's going on. I've quoted this from Stout, a book by Stout, which is called The Groundwork of Psychology, which is just a short overview over the work he has done, and he has much more to say in other books in which he unpacks this a bit more. So take the synchronic case, where we took a look at why does attention at one time require connected objects? And I think the answer you get from Stout's analytic psychology is this. So yes, you can simultaneously visually attend to a movement and auditory. Imagine you hear a sound and you see a movement. Yeah, you can simultaneously attend to the movement and to the sound, but only if these are part of one and the same attention process. You know, there's one attention process, and these two things appear in this one attention process as say sides or aspects. So when do you have the same attention process? When are these things part of the same attention process? Well, we know that attention processes are individuated by interest. Yeah, attention process is a perception done to satisfy an interest. So we have the same attention process if there's one interest which is satisfied by it, and these two, visual attention, auditory attention, they count as parts of the same attention process. If there's an interest, one interest which is satisfied by attending to visually attending and auditorily attending at the same time. What kind of interest can that be that you attend to the sound and attend to the movement at the same time? Which interest is satisfied? Well, it's an interest in the connection between the things which the sounds, the notes, and the movements. And the connection will be a relation between the sounds and the movements. For instance, that the sound is an effect of the movement. You know, you're interested in what is the relation between them. So then, if you go back and fully describe what kind of attention there is, what is this process of attention, you would say is an attention directed on the relation between the movement and the sound. And so described, it becomes intelligible that you can attend to these two things at the same time. But then what you really associate the kind of proper object of attention is a relation. Hence the idea that, yes, you can attend at one time to some things, to many things, but only if you think of them as in relation. And then in this one movement, they will appear to you as, now you can have different ways, as part of a whole or as in relation, and so on and so forth. Okay, I'm almost there. Stout has interesting ideas. So this was all about one can only attend to one object at one time. Now he has also ideas about how you do it over time, one object over time. That's mainly in a manual of psychology, which is a much longer book, which is sort of say condensed down in the groundwork. Again, you get an idea that there are single movements of attention. There's one movement of attention but that movement of attention can actually be like a movement of like a run or something like that. It can take time. And the movement of attention is a perceiving, and that perceiving can last a while. Yeah? Think of bird observation or something like that. Can last over time, and it can last over time because it can, different phases, aspects of perceiving can be in the service of satisfying one and the same interest. So you get phases or parts of perceiving if they contribute to the satisfaction of one interest. And now, I mean, think of an example. You are in your living room and you find that on the rug there's a strange line or figure of something, and you take an interest in it. You take an interest in it, you become driven to find something out about it. And there will now be one movement of attention, and this movement of attention will follow. You become interested. Where does this lead to? What kind of thing is this? Will this movement of attention, you will have different phases. First this bit, then that bit, and then you look over there, and then you go over there. I won't act it out too much today. And you could say that these phases are integrated. Yes? You have first, you see the beginning of this strange stuff on the floor, of this trace or whatever it is, and you see beginning very well, and the other stuff you see not that well, and then in the next phase you see the stuff which you didn't see very well, you see now much better, and so on and so forth. So they're interlinked, and you could say one phase anticipates something of the other phase, and so on. What you then have, that different phases reveal to you different. So in one movement of attention, the different phases reveal to you objects. In this case, aspects, segments of a trace, but in a way that they are related. You think of them now as adjacent or something. Not you think of them, but you take them. They visually appear to you as adjacent. You follow a trail. So this is thoroughly, at least supposed to be thoroughly non-intellectual. And the example you get all the time in Stout and so on is that the cat hunting the mouse, the kitten playing with the ball. Yeah, it seems to them, Stout assures us, I find it very difficult to put myself in the shoes of a kitten, seems struck out to be dealing with a single complex situation, which includes not only the mouse or the ball, but all circumstances or occurrences which maybe turn out to be relevant to their governing interest. So interest organize your perception in such a way that things perceived seem to be integrated, seem to be following up on each other, seem to be related. So we again get now a trans-temporal idea about attention making things appear as related. Okay, I talked longer than I thought, but that's hopefully okay. Now let's go back to illusionism. Yeah. So on the one hand, we got now, if we bring in something like interest-driven perception, we get a kind of rationale for lots of theses. Yeah, we get an idea how it works and why it should be like that. But we get also a bit more mileage in explaining why the folk are so keen on wholes. Yeah, wholes like one forest, one mountain range, one ocean, and so on. And the thing is, I mean, if we bring in interest, so we need interest. Interest-driven perception is attention, and then attention gives us the appearance of some things as connected, as forming whatever you want to call it, relational complexes or not. Then you can tell a richer story about the illusion we are undergoing. Yeah. So for some things, and it is so that if they are related, we take a particular interest in them, so related. A forest is many things between which several relations obtain, but they are quite interesting for you or interesting for us, and they're all kind of permanent interest. You want to go, and of the many things you want to cut some down, and maybe you want to protect them, to own them, and so on. So you got manys, which are so related that we have form a habit of being interested in them or being permanently interested. And these are the wholes of, that's why we think of common sense world as containing additional wholes. Yeah. And that's kind of inescapable illusion. You might tell me a lot about mereological, that there are no wholes, that we have good reason for there are no wholes. But so that my interest-driven perception will make me ignore, will not be permeated by that. It will not affect it. So we got a kind of richer story about this form of illusion, which is richer than this. We have this collective names that are quite good for reasoning, but I don't tell you that much about it. Then you can say something very general about lots of philosophical position by talking about this. Yeah. So here's again Stout when he talks about he has a book called Studies in Philosophy and Psychology, which is published when he's already in his 60s, and in which he looks back at his career and he says, as a young man, was somehow very influenced by Clifford and Lotze. And he said, well, these guys are not subjective idealists. Yeah, they hold that what appears to us as a material world really is a system of actually existing, enduring, changing, and interacting. But they deny that either the primary or the secondary characters belong to the intrinsic nature of matter as it is in itself. It is we who qualify by predicates drawn from the immediate content of our own sense experience, which do not belong to it. If we ask what it is in itself, we can only conceive of it after the analogy of what we find in our own mental life. Yeah, that's, I think, what Lotze would call spiritualism. Yeah? There's matter. Matter is basically impenetrable to us. If we try to conceive of matter, conceptually fundamental things are drawn from the first person experience. And unity is something of which we have, at least of the appearance of unity, we have a kind of first person grip on that. And we import this by talking about, at least in common sense, by talking about the world as containing wholes. So this illustrates one very general, maybe meta-philosophical view these people have, namely that it's not subjective idealism that you really think there is the mind constitutes the world, or there is just mind stuff, or what soul around, yeah. But no, there's matter, it interacts in some way, but conceptually fundamental is what we can get, the concepts we acquire by first-person experience. A more important take-home message is something which Ward spells out in respect to Kantian philosophers, Kantian and Neo-Kantian. And here I just read it to you because it's very nicely put, also slightly wrong, I think. So before I read it, remember that for Lotze, Stout, interest is a very fundamental idea, and interest is what in the end does a lot of explanatory work in this story. And he is Ward expanding on that. He says Kant, no doubt, well in declaring the synthetic unity of apperception to be the paramount principle of knowledge. But it's surely a mistake to suppose any synthesis or any unity possible apart from motives to action and a practical interest in things. The centrality and organization, I intend the words to be taken very literally, which all concrete experience manifests, could never arise to a merely cognitive subject, nor to us if our intellective were independent of our practical powers. So it's really, I think this is an overstatement. The overstatement is Kant is wrong, yeah, because he thinks there are some unities which are formed in a merely cognitive subject, something which has no practical powers, no emotions, no interests. That's wrong, yeah, because again he tends here to mereological idealism, because any unity, we can only understand any unity in terms of practical interests. Yeah. I think that's wrong, because also people like Lotze and all these other guys think there is the unity of consciousness. And that's just a given. You cannot see anything about it. And it's not due to any interest. But I think the true core of this is to say there are many unities, not the unity of consciousness. There are many other unities, especially unities which have something like an organization in periphery, central, foreground, background. For these unities, we need something like practical interests, and they are observer dependent. I've slipped now into mereological idealism. Yeah? The appearance that there are such unities, the appearance that they have a core, a focus, and a periphery, that can only be understood if you bring in practical interests. And so here we have one road into pragmatism. I mean, pragmatism is again too much. Yeah? One road into interest could be aesthetic interest, but one road into saying that the Kantian thought about unity is not enough. We need something else, and that can, in part, be only something practical or aesthetically. Okay, I've spoken much longer than I thought I would. Thank you very much. I think I should stop sharing my slides. Oh, you can bring me back. Okay, very good.
So thank you, Professor Mark Textor, for the interesting presentation. Now, Professor André Leclerc will make some comments on it. So, André. Quer segurar ou quer colocar aqui na outra?
Okay. Okay.
Is it okay, the sound?
You can hear me, Mark?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for that opportunity. I'm not a reader of Lot's work, but I have learned quite a lot in that opportunity, and I want to thank also Professor Textor for his patience. It has been extremely profitable for me interacting with you in the last days. So I thank you for that. I will just read my short text, 2 pages and a half, and then we go to the debate. Okay. When I started reading Mark's paper, I remembered an example given by Hilary Putnam while discussing criteria for something to be an object. He said he once had a table lamp, and each time he moved the lampshade fell. Putnam was discussing a substantial view of what an object is, not a formal view à la Frege. An object is anything that is not a function. A mereological criterion could be that when an object is dislodged, all its parts must go together. Hence, Putnam's example. The table lamp seems to form a unity, but that results from the way we look at it and use it. Lot's doctrine exposed by Mark is called mereological illusionism or mereological fictionalism. There are no wholes or unities, no real composition resulting in a real one. The unity is in the eye of the beholder, not in the world. Unity, I quote Mark's paper, unity is a relation between a plurality and a spectator. Mark says, but the relation is not one of supervenience or emergence. The unity may have a practical value, but ontologically, it is an illusion. It does not add nothing to the ontological furniture of the world. Mark has no hard time showing the superiority of mereological fictionalism over other doctrines mentioned at the beginning of his talk, namely universalism, eliminativism, nihilism, and mereological idealism. This is already quite something. My first question to Mark concerns the range of application of Lot's doctrine. Does it apply to any object whatsoever or only to substantive physical objects? Does it apply to actions, objects represented in painting, fictional characters and cultural objects in general, propositions, illocutionary acts, melodies, mental phenomena? Well, Mark gave me an answer, an interesting answer. He says, I quote, the theory applies to anything that can be attended to. I think this rules out abstract object like proposition, etc. Okay, in the PowerPoint presentation today, he says A and B appear as parts of a unity to P if and only if P perceptually attends to A and B together. So I think this answer part of my first question. My second question has to do with the causal powers of the wholes or unities. All the examples used by James and Royce indicate that the doctrine has been understood as applying mainly to physical objects, natural objects, and concrete artifacts. If James' example, the one relative to water, what appears as water is H2O, remember. If that example is a good illustration of the realm of application, maybe we must face a problem. If the water appears to us, if the way water appears to us is something like an illusion, we must ask if illusions can have causal powers, which is doubtful. It is hard to believe that water has no causal powers at all. If water, the stuff, with all its phenomenal properties, translucid, tasteless, etc., inherits the causal powers of its parts, then it is not a mere illusion after all. If it is not, if it does not have any causal powers, then its very existence is questionable, following the famous Alexander's maxim, to be is to have causal powers. Generalizing the problem, if unities have an illusory character created by the mind of the spectator, it seems that the causal work must come from the micro level, say atoms or molecules, maybe more than that. Anyway, and then we are on a slippery slope. Maybe fictionalism just amounts to a kind of eliminativism. This would jeopardize the value of our causal talks. The causal relation describing everyday life in our everyday talk would be merely epiphenomenal, or describe something epiphenomenal in character. To say that the litmus paper turned red because the solution was acid would just be a façon de parler. Perhaps we should simply bite the bullet. In this perspective, the world, especially the Lebenswelt, seems to lose its consistency. Is it really a consequence of Locke's doctrine? I would now like to tackle another problem. What is a melody? Is it a temporal? It is a temporal object, right? It is a succession of notes with some quality of rhythm and modulation. It is composed of parts, and someone can attend perceptually to each note. Here I'm talking of token melodies, not melodies, symphony as a type. We can have a type symphony as a referential target. I can speak of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony in general, without thinking about any concrete presentation of the symphony in with a specific maestro in an orchestra in concrete in a theater somewhere. So I'm talking of token melodies. They have a physical constitution, sound waves, but what we call melody is, or so it seems to me, the unity in the ear of the listener. According to Husserl's reticulum of time, a structure of retention and protension is at work passively in the constitution of a temporal object like a melody. That structure confers unity to our sensorial experience in general and to temporal intentional objects. So the melody is the product of our attention. But is it correct to say that what we feel and sometimes enjoy so much is an illusion? Finally, verbal behavior is something quite complex. And in the perception of something complex, the attention naturally is naturally directed to the most salient or relevant features of the complex. In a verbal interaction, the attention is mainly directed to the conventional signs emitted by the speaker's voice. But the hearer's mind also received the impressions of the circumstances in which the conventional signs have been emitted. The tone of voice, the facial expression, what we perceive through mind reading, we perceive all these other components obliquely, so to speak, but they are in the hearer's mind. We attend somehow to these aspects of verbal interaction. And they determine our final understanding of an utterance. So, is it true that one can only attend to one thing at a time? It seems to me that human communication requires more than one thing at a time. Maybe here the distinction between to attend to something and to attend fully to something may have a role to play. Well, these are just a few reactions to Mark's paper. So I will stop here. There are many interesting aspects that I do not touch, but I would like very much to hear you, Mark, on these few topics. Thank you.
Back to me now.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you for sending me a draft of this and kind of thoughts about it. So I take the questions not in the order in which they appear, but I start with the one on the melody. Is it correct to say that what we feel and sometimes enjoy is an illusion, or so much as an illusion? Because I think that's a very fruitful question, and it gets us a bit into aesthetics. I'm not an expert on aesthetics, but when I thought about the question, I remembered a talk by Dick Zangwill, and he said we sometimes, it was very very peculiar talk, but the example stuck in my mind. So he said, I sat in a plane and flew over a certain kind of cloud formation, and it looked like spun wool or something. And I knew it was not spun wool. It was an illusion, but I still enjoyed it. And I think that's rings to me plausible. It's quite often that we enjoy illusions, even though we can see through them. If you go to the cinema, I'm pretty sure that I'm taken in by the film. I enjoy it, but I'm clear it's not, that's not how things are at the moment. Yeah? So there's a view in aesthetics which Zangwill is a proponent of, and it's a kind of view about the metaphysics of beauty, and which he calls this, and I think it might be a quite general accepted term, aesthetic formalism. And for the aesthetic formalist, what aesthetic properties like beauty or being enjoyable depend on is appearances. And for the aesthetic formalist, it doesn't matter whether the appearances are vertical or not. It just need to be, you need to immerse yourself in the appearances, and they make things nice or not nice, beautiful or not beautiful. So my inclinations are to go with the aesthetic formalist, quite generally, about lots of things. The illusions are what makes, at least what can make for beauty and all this stuff. So I would say, that's why I find your question fruitful. If you want to be a very logical illusionist, you better become a formalist about aesthetics. And formalism about aesthetic formalism seems not intrinsically nonsensical. It seems to be a view you could hold or defend. But it shows, I mean, interaction between two different areas of philosophy. And so there's behind this question, or maybe you have done different aesthetic intuitions, like aesthetic formalism is not the way to go. You need to, the aesthetic properties of things depend maybe on historical properties or richer properties. But that's to see, then that's where the action is there. That's what we need to discuss then further. But so see, there is aesthetic views which line up with the view I've presented. So I think that leads to fruitful further discussion in aesthetics. Okay, verbal behavior. So one thing is, I don't propose the kind of simple-minded view that one thing one can attend to one can attend to only one thing at a time. One can attend to many things at a time if they are connected, if there are relations between them. However, really attends to are the relations. I mean, it's not relations in the sense of next to. Yeah, it's not the universal relation, but the instantiated relation between these things. I think that on the one hand already gets a grip on this question. Yeah, you can this voice, facial expression, and so on is like attending simultaneously to the movement and the sound. What you do is you attend to the relation between them. And now you need to say more what the relation between these particular things is. But then I'm not really on board with the idea that when I attend to verbal interaction, I attend really to the conventional signs or so on and so forth. I mean, I'm actually quite convinced about what Husserl himself says about these things. When I say something, what you attend to, what your attention is sucked up into is the message. Yeah, it's the meaning I bring out. I mean, after a few seconds after I've said something, you will not be able to retrieve the wording, yeah, the conventional sounds which transmitted the meaning. Or maybe even if there are some people talking who said it, but you will be able to recapture the message. Save the world, or logicism is wrong. Yeah, that's what you are paying attention to, because that's what's important here. That's the thing which commands and attracts your attention. So I think I would work this example maybe differently. Okay, first question. So maybe need to ask you a bit about it. So first, I give you my spin on it. So I find it difficult to understand what Husserl means by Lebenswelt. But if we take by Lebenswelt something like what people like before, so like Avenarius also thought, it's just the things. If I would ask you to write down the things you take for granted, and you come up with a list like there are other people, and so on. Sometimes stuff causes other things, or if it's that, then I would say, okay, I understand that. Yeah, there's something like maybe the view of a person at a time, the common sense view, they're not spoiled by science view. Then I would say, yeah, I can understand that. And you're right. I mean, the mereological illusionist says there are no holes. They have no causal. Because there are no holes, they have no causal powers. All the action, all the causal interaction is at the level of the many. Yeah, the many working in concert. That's the view. And now, is that bad for the common sense view? I mean, the common sense view is not a scientific doctrine. It's not something which can be really refuted or rejected like a theory. It's just the set of beliefs people have and which organize their life. I think that can still organize your life, also is largely false. It's useful, but largely false. And I think the advantage of the illusionism I've presented is that it explains how this still can organize your life and how it can appear plausible to you to think, to act as if there were holes. Also, you might be informed, you might be in contact with philosophers who tell you there are no holes, because it's much more perceptual. Yeah, it's built into perceptual attention that things appear to you as a whole, and you can't really shake that off. So I think I would say, not sure about losing its consistency. I mean, it might be consistent or not, but it will be to a certain extent your common sense view is false. But that might be a falsity which doesn't matter scientifically and which might still get every one of us what we want, and that's all right. That's something we can accept and live with. And the view I've presented gives you the resources to explain why this is so. So I think it's not an objection, it's rather something which sheds light on the character of what Noether proposes. And you have to think, I mean, all these metaphysicians would say, like, at the fundamental level, the world is quite different from what you guys think they are. So it's just part and parcel of this kind of metaphysics. I think I should stop there. So I thank you again. I thought the question about, especially the question about melodies is really very fruitful and intriguing. And the other questions are also very fruitful. Here's my answer to that.
As to the melody, we all enjoy the same illusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like objectivity. Objectivity is a construction from intersubjectivity. A shadow, for instance, can be measured. It can be seen by many different people.
Mm-hmm.
But in itself, it is not something quite substantive, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But it depends on the presence of an object in the way of a source of light. You know?
Mm-hmm.
But we can enjoy the same illusion.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to confer some kind of objectivity to an illusion.
Yes.
So, well,
I mean,
it's a bit contradictory in my view.
I'm not, I think the melody is not. What is denied is that there's something on top of all the relations, and there are relations, there are notes, and they are there. They are really not denied. And if people with the right kind of sensitivity and the right kind of education, in the case of some melodies, are around, they will tend to perceive the same unities and maybe have the same aesthetic responses to it. But I think there's still enough ground to have some kind of objectivity.
So thank you very much to both of you. We'll now open a question. I'm not with the microphone. Can you hear me? Is that the question? Yes.
Yeah. Thanks again for the questions and the comments. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So we'll now open a question session. Thank you for both of you. First of all, I would like to know if Professor Simons or Professor Übel would like to. Okay. So Professor Simons, your question.
Thank you, Mark. Two points on the Mariology. I do agree that Mariological idealism is bordering on insanity. On illusionism, I wouldn't like to believe it's a general recipe for when many things make one. I think there are cases, probably quite a lot of important cases, where it's intrinsic relations among the parts of the various parts of a whole which make it into a whole. So certain kinds of causation and so forth. But I do think there probably are some cases where, shall we say, unity of attention or unity of interest or of some kind of observer-dependent phenomenon contributes to our perceiving as a single thing a multiplicity of objects which aren't necessarily intrinsically connected to one another. I guess you might think of things like, I don't know, English female novelists of the 19th century. They have some fairly broad thing in common. But if you are fanatically interested in 19th century English literature, you might well conceive of them as a block. I don't know. I haven't been able to come up with a very clear example, but I'll think about it. That's the first thing. The second thing is the question about whether you can attend to more than one thing at once. Seems to me to be basically an empirical question, which it's up to experimental psychologists to investigate. And the interesting thing is that they're not unified on their opinion. In multitasking, which is generally taken to be a counterexample to the ability to attend only to one thing at once, some psychologists say, yes, it is genuinely split attention. And so multitasking is a phenomenon which proves that you can attend to more than one thing at once. And others say, no, it isn't. It's just a question of very rapid transfer of attention from one task to another. The example I like to give, and I have no idea how psychologically you would analyze it, is this shows you how American politics has changed since the 19th century. The 20th president of the USA, James Garfield, was ambidextrous, and the story goes that he could write a sentence in Latin with his right hand while simultaneously writing its Greek translation with his left hand. Now, whether that was just quick back and forth or whether it was partly automaton action, I don't know. But it does strike me as something that really philosophers shouldn't pronounce about. Saying, oh, well, it's just a tautology that if something has your attention, then you're not attending to anything else. I think that's just philosophers stepping in where they shouldn't. So I'm open to persuasion one way or the other by empirical results. The final thing I want to mention is that one of the things that you didn't talk about was the idea of degrees of unity. If you're thinking about material things in the material world, it strikes me that some things seem to be more unified in themselves than others. So, for example, an atom or a physical body or a star or a planet do seem to be much more unified than, say, a cloud or a solar system or a galaxy, even though there are, of course, different kinds of relations between the various objects making up the multiplicity. Thanks.
Okay, where do I start? Maybe it's the first question. So, yeah, I mean, you could have a weak reading of illusionism and say there are some holes to which it applies. There's some, but that's, I think, it will be quite difficult to defend this, but I think the story or the idea Lotze and his followers have is there are really no unities in natural life. And there's kind of regress argument behind it. I think the argument goes roughly like this. Look, what makes in natural, in the natural world, things into a unity is a kind of joint causal effect. You know, the film crew are some people who work together to produce one film. Well, what is one film? And so the story goes, and it needs to bottom out somewhere. And you think the thing where it bottoms out must be the unity of attention or consciousness of a perceiver. It's always why is that one effect? Why is that one thing? Okay, maybe you're not convinced by that. That's fine, but I think
anecdotes only go so far, and an awful lot of the examples, both that you gave and that Lotze gives and Stout and so on, are just stories. I mean, they're good stories because they illustrate the point, but that doesn't mean that they have universal application or import. So it would be, I mean, I take the point that you want to avoid some kind of infinite regress, but if, okay, the way to stop certain kinds of infinite regress, of course, is not to let them start. So if you concentrate on what one might call intrinsic unity of pluralities making up one whole, and leave observers out of it, then if you can make a plausible story about some of those cases, you know, really what you might call well-integrated entities, then you can use that as the bedrock on which to base questions about cases where several things like that appear to us to be one thing, but really in themselves are not. So I would just go at it from another angle. I mean, I always start from the common sense view anyway, that some things make wholes and some things don't.
Okay, I mean, maybe you can see like the idea is that, well, I guess the response would be, if we have relations and the things, the manys and the relations, we have all we need. We don't need on top of that the big thing. And I think the same goes for the intrinsic relations. They are not doing anything differently. So it's I guess it's kind of intrinsic relation between 2 and 3, that the one is the successor of the other and the one is the predecessor, and so on and so forth. It doesn't make them into a particular whole. So if you have in general pluralities on board and can talk about the many and their relations, I don't think really that the intrinsicness adds that much. But I'm happy for you to convince me. Well, it just, can I go to the other questions? Then, is it an empirical question? So some of my colleagues do empirical research or comment on empirical research on attention, and there are lots of experiments, and it's always difficult to say whether it's attention is divided or whether there's a disturbance somehow which is registered in a particular way. So I think we need some kind of maybe philosophers shouldn't pronounce on it, but we need some kind of philosophical guide and sharpening of our concepts. And I take this idea from O'Shaughnessy and so on as a kind of maybe guiding principle. And you can see it in your Garfield example. Stout has a very similar example in which someone draws the body of a horse with one hand and the head of the horse with another hand. The Garfield example is one where there's a clear connection between the things which are drawn. I mean, the one is the translation of the other. So the kind of guiding principle is that unity can be maintained if we find relations, if the things are attended to stand in certain relations. And that maybe that generates empirical hypotheses or something. There's also something which I haven't mentioned, which brings this out quite better. I mean, Lotze was a actual practitioner of medicine, and when he discusses this is all in the service of something like mental well-being. You know, the end of medizinische, I mean, it's called medizinische Psychologie because it's psychology which has an input into medicine. And what they say is rather, it's not like it's a necessary and sufficient condition for, in any kind of conceptual sense, for attending or so. It's rather in a healthy mind, attention doesn't split in this way. Yeah. So Stout has looked at empirical work, and he thinks that people who are suffering from, I don't know if that's true, I don't know what he said, people who are hysteric, they can do completely different things. So they fully immerse at the same time, but that's something like a mental breakdown. Yeah. So it's something like, I think one should, I haven't talked about this, but I think I should say more about it in the next version of this. This is rather like, how does a healthy mind work? Then what is a mind, or what is attention? It's like conditions of well working in a healthy thinker. Degrees of attention. It's a very good question. I have no answer about this, and I don't know how I would get degrees of attention into this picture. So I take that as a kind of homework exercise. I need to think about that.
Can I come back to just one thing?
Yeah. You can further comment.
When you have many, which through mereological illusionism or attentionism or whatever, is unified by us into one, whether through relations or whatever, I take the relations point. Where does the oneness of the basic ones come from?
Well, there are some things which don't have principles of composition or principles of unity, and one of them is consciousness. Okay, I can give you, I mean, I sent you at one point a paper about that in which I argue for it. And the argument for that goes usually not usually, is an argument saying, look, what we can do is compare things. You couldn't compare things if they were sort of these in different parts of your consciousness. You need to be, these two need to be, and imagine you compare dark red and light red, two shades of it. What you need to be able is, back and forth between them. And while you focus your attention on that thing, this is still there in one consciousness, and you move back and forth. So that's, and the claim is if that happens, if that's the case, then, okay, two views now, the attending thing, there's an attending thing, and that is an indivisible. I think that's a bit strong. The weaker claim is the unity of consciousness underlies this, and it's something which is indivisible in the sense it's not composed of prior parts, but one can distinguish parts in it by respect to intentional objects. But there's no story of composition about consciousness. That's one of the key ideas then attention is supposed to be a simple act. It doesn't have any parts it's not composed of anything. And the argument there is, look, if you attend to this thing more than to that thing, there's a necessary connection. If attention goes to, the degree goes up here, it goes down there. And that's not simply, it's a necessary connection. Necessary connection between distinct existences are unpleasant, so there is no distinct existences. Attention is one. So you get lots of ones, but not ones which are composed of others, but really simples when it comes to the mind. And that's why the mind can produces illusions.
Thank you. Do you want to pose a question? Yeah, you can go on.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very interesting and an example of strange flowers in the garden of philosophy. So let me start with one historical, a couple of things. One historical question. That slogan, "One can only attempt to one thing at a time." I'm I'm wondering whether that's as it were a Lotzer version of a principle that Herbart had, namely what he called die Enge des Bewusstseins, the narrowness of consciousness, and what Lotzer does there is, as it were, focus that idea on attention itself. So that's one thing. Another question is, when you spoke early on about Mariological fictionalism, you kind of accused it of intellectualism, and I'm wondering whether that would have to be the only form of fictionalism, whether there couldn't be, and some of the things you seem to say would go in a different direction, what you might call an evolutionary fictionalism, namely that it's just, evolutionarily, beneficial for us, and it's an evolutionary supported illusion to think of all these things. What I have in mind here is, I don't really know lots of, but what I have here is a maybe vaguely parallel phenomenon in Ernst Mach, who kind of says at some point that die Natur ist nur einmal da. Nature is there only once. So basically, thereby expressing a certain skepticism as to the veridicality of our using the same concept for different phenomena happening at different time. That this is, that, and obviously he thinks that our habit and apparent ability to get away with this has to do with what it allows us, the ability to organ, that what it allows us to do, namely organize our experience, etc., kind of thing. And then the last point, I don't know whether you want to come back to the point, but namely the question that Peter raised, it occurred to me as well. You said, yeah, well, you can defend the Mariological illusionism with some kind of regress argument, and Peter then asks you the question, well, hang on, can't you apply the regress argument to the Mariological illusionists? And you responded by saying, well, no, there are certain basic things, and you focused upon the unity of consciousness and the unity of attention and some, that's fine. But what about the thing? At some point earlier, you also said, well, look, for Mariological illusionists, they say, all we need is things and relations. Now, Peter was asking, well, where do you get the things in? Couldn't a regress argument set up there that all the things you think is one thing, well, that splits into, it goes, the regress goes off into the other direction there, and where do we end? So, yeah, that kind of thing. So I'm not quite sure how you would answer to that part of kind of Peter's question, but otherwise, thank you for that very stimulating, interesting walk through metaphysics.
Okay, so Herbart, I could talk a long time about Herbart, but yeah, you're right. I mean, there's something. Herbart doesn't use. So think of attention at one time to one object. You travel that from understanding of attention to get an idea of what is one object. And then it turns out that that one object can be things related to each other. And Herbert is very keen on the narrowness of mind, which is just attention. But he presupposes a substantial one there. And the substantial one is the mental substance. So Herbert starts out by saying, yeah, there is the soul. The soul is a substance, therefore it is simple. Therefore, it can only have one idea at a time. And what psychology does is now it studies processes of inhibition and strengthening, which over time lead to one idea in one substance. So Howard does the thing the other way around. You look puzzled, but does it make that clearer? So, I mean, you have to think of Howard as a metaphysical psychologist.
Yeah.
You cannot do psychology without metaphysics, because psychology has no proper observational basis.
I see. So what you're saying is that Herbert goes from a certain metaphysical conception and he imposes that on what he thinks is possible attention-wise, and therefore he talks about the narrowness of consciousness, whereas Lotze starts with the narrowness of consciousness and tries to get some metaphysics out of it. But the joint focus they both have is that enge des Bewusstseins. That
I think
that's a phenomenon they both kind of, if not start with, but around which their thinking turns in these matters.
I think that's right. Not just of I mean, all these people, if you look at Stout and so on, Stout's first papers in mind were on Herbert. Yeah. Herbert is one of the few people who is quoted by Lotze. So lots of philosophical psychology, 19th, early 20th century is downstream from Herbert. They take their agenda, and then you get certain modifications. But what they don't want to do is, I mean, if you in the second volume of Herbert's psychology, what is it called again? Psychology, empiricism, mathematics, something like that. He says, so on the one hand, he wants to side with the Zeno von Elea and say a substance is really one. Yeah, there's no plurality of parts in it. But then he wants to side with Leibniz and say there are many substances. But yeah, you put in a lot of metaphysics before you can start with psychology, and then the psychological results are derived in part from your metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right, I mean, attention is that topic, is the big topic, I think, in at least German psychology and the psychology influenced by it in America and England. Remind me of a second question. Mach.
The evolutionary fictionalism, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can see something. So, I think of illusionism as a form of fictionalism. Yeah.
Okay.
And the fictionalism of, I mean, if you read modern day fictionalists like Rosen and Dorr, I don't know if Peter gets more from them, but they just say fictions are good, but we don't tell you very much about it. And you would think about fictionalism like the linguistic fictionalism, which is maybe suggested by Leibniz, where you just think you have the singular names, but they are not semantically singular. You think if you inform people about this, if you tell them a bit about grammar or give them a book about linguistics, you would say, okay, then they should get it. They should switch out of this. A form of fictionalism like this illusionism, which locates the problem, so the illusion somewhere else, is favorable. And I agree with you that Mach is something like a fictionalist for other stuff, and it's based on look, our faculties are built in such a way that these illusions are beneficial for us. Yeah, I don't see really I mean, so I would like to be sympathetic to that. If I had a better story, how the illusion I'm interested in arises in evolutionary terms, and I have that, don't have that yet.
Okay.
You can see Bradley is fishing for something like that.
I see.
Last question: where do we get things from? Well, you need to assume that there are some. Do we need to assume that question for Peter that there are some symbols? I mean, would this work with Gang? Gang is everything is divisible forever. Yeah, there's no bottom level.
Yeah.
I guess it would. If enough Gang is related in the right way to engender the illusions. So you don't even need symbols. I say boldly now.
Well, that's a research program. Great, thank you. That's good.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Simons and Übel, for your questions. Does anyone from the audience has any questions? Okay, Professor Max.
Yeah, let me thank for your inspiring talk. So I'm Ingolf Max from Leipzig University in Germany, and I'm very interested in relation between music and logic. I did something about, get some idea, form an idea also about what I would call internal harmony. My question is, could we learn something with respect to your talk, your understanding of a relation of creating unities with attention, with respect to understanding, so to speak, unities in music? The thing is that you stressed or had a heavy stress on attention is one. For example, if we say something that we have an attention to 3 tones, then it should be a melody, or could be a melody, could be also a chord. So the question is it the same attention or do we have different attentions? The thing is, for example, if you first look at the music score, and you can see sometimes in notation, for example, see if I have a horizontal order, maybe it's a kind of melody. If I have a vertical order, maybe it's a kind of a chord. The interesting point is there's something in between, which I sometimes have a broken chord. For example, if you are a guitar player, sometimes you get only a name for a chord, and then you can play also a broken chord. That's the first point. That I'm not sure if what's the relation between a melody and a chord with respect to unity. Is it only one unity, or have we 2 unities? The second one is if you look at a hearer, so some hear something, with respect to your thing, if you can have attention to 2 things together, if you have, for example, a broken chord, there is this discussion with respect to a hearer, if a hearer is able to hear a melody or a chord. And the problem is also that the consequence would be, is it possible at all to hear a chord as a melody or the other way around? So a hearer can have another attention, so to speak, which is indispensable of a score. And the last one is, or last point is a logical one, because I was so impressed with Charles Sanders Peirce take chords as an example of a irreducible ternary relation. So a melody, you have 3 argument positions because you have 3 tones. And his argument was, because usually logicians say everything you can reduce by definition to binary, to 2-placed relations. So you mentioned several times relation, and with respect to a melody and a chord, a logical argument could be, independent of the attention, so to speak, to say that the logical form of a melody is in a sense reducible to a reconstruction using binary relations, but that's not possible for chords. So you need irreducible. Maybe that's a discussion, because there are a lot of people will not accept Peirce's point. But I think, from my point of view, I like this point that there is, so to speak, that chords are a really good example of so to speak, irreducible ternary relation.
Okay, so I don't think I've got quite the broken chords point. So I need to maybe ask again about it. But as a kind of general answer, so lots is most, maybe not most famous, but one of Lotz's students was Karl Stumpf, and Stumpf wrote Tonpsychologie. So if you know that. Tonpsychologie is roughly 1,000 pages about what it is to hear a chord. And it's all inspired by what we just discussed. Yeah? So luckily, I just have this open. So here's page 309 from Tonpsychologie. And he says, what is it to hear a chord? And he says, I just read it in German, because we both, do I translate it now? I read it first in German, and you can see whether we translate it. Die Komponenten müssen als Glieder eines bestimmten Verhältnisses aufgefasst werden, welches zu dem Verhältnis der bloßen Gleichzeitigkeit noch hinzukommt, nämlich als Glieder eines Intervalls zum Beispiel. Ja, wenn in einem solchen Fall das Interesse sich dem Verhältnis, Relation, als solchem zuwendet, so kann es nicht bloß, sondern muss zugleich beiden Gliedern zugewendet sein. So, hearing a chord is for the Lotzian Stumpf an example of apprehending a relation. And because you apprehend the relation, not any relation, but this very particular relation now, you must apprehend the members of the relation, or the things standing in the relation. And if it's a multigrade relation, if it's more than one thing, then you have an argument that there is a multigrade relation apprehended. Because it's apprehended as one, you cannot break it down. You cannot break it down to a relation of this thing and that thing and that thing. So I think that speaks to the Peirce point, that what we need to do is, if we have chords and experience something as a chord, I mean, I can't do it because my hearing is not good enough, then we have an argument for irreducible multigrade relations.
The interesting thing is that it is also the argument at the beginning, because a chord is one sound. And you can say a melody, you have three sounds. But you would like to have it as a unity. So you have it, in a sense, the other way around. In one case, you have three perceptions and say that's a unity, so to speak, with external relations between tones. And the other way, you say you have only one sound. Now it's a problem, is this an atom? No, it's not an atom, because it has relations internally. And the last question was, in this case, maybe in the quotation, there's no information about binary or ternary relations, only something like relation. But the point would be then for this thing that, so to speak, that a chord is not the sum of two intervals. That's the main point.
Yeah.
For Peirce. So you cannot say that if you play two interval sounds, so also you have two tones as a sound, another interval sound, and you put them together, you get a sequence of two interval sounds, but not a chord. So the interesting thing is that is something in itself, so to speak, at its internal structure. And from my point of view, it would be very important, if you speak about unities, so to speak, to keep track of these kind of logical form also.
Yeah, so I mean, what you said is I think the problem which is at the beginning of two volumes of Tonpsychologie. Yeah? Is it a plurality which is experienced as one, or is it a unity which is then somehow unfolded in parts by us? And it's a long story, but in the end he comes to the conclusion that sometimes experiencing a plurality appears to us as one thing. Yeah? We experience it as one thing because the relations are, intuitively speaking, so tight between them. I don't think I've answered that, but the kind of general gist is a lot in psychology of music, in the origin in Stumpf, is inspired by this. On the next page, I mean, so this is the beginning of the discussion of hearing chords. On the next page is about the lion and the snake fighting and how plausible this is. Yeah. So this is kind of framework for this psychology of sound and psychology of chords.
May I have another example, if I can ask this? Because my parents were musicians, and usually if you have, for example, let's take the 3 tones as a melody, and when you can create units, so to speak, of these 3 tones. For example, can decide if you play a piece to take the first 2 notes as one unit, and then the third one, or the other way around, for example, to take the first one and then the other 2. And sometimes there is a strong discussion, so to speak, about the right interpretation of music. So take the first unit creation, so to speak, or the second one. And the interesting thing is that, so to speak, the music player is between the score and the hearer. So the hearer can have an expectation, it's my own experience, that I don't like this kind of unity. For example, if one plays it, so put the first 2 things together and then the third one, and I would expect the other way around, then I have not a good feeling. So it would be this aesthetic part. But the thing is, so to speak, that creating of a unity or subunities with respect to an interpreter can be different from the mind, so to speak, of a hearer. And my question would be, can we learn something with respect to your proposal also about, so to speak, the conflicts between different minds, the mind of a player and the mind of a hearer?
Yeah, it makes at least room for that. Yeah, if there would be like if unities were something like natural joints in reality, yeah, then that conflict would be quite difficult to understand. But if there's some kind of observer, maybe there's some kind of producer relativity, then the conflict becomes, there's at least room to have such a conflict, quite naturally, I think.
Okay.
So we have time for perhaps one more question. Okay.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your talk. Forgive me if I didn't quite understand whether interest is a property of the subject or interest is a property of the object. The question would be, wouldn't something need to catch my attention for me to address it? And if that happens, that something was already a unit when it caught my attention, or only after I direct my attention to it?
So I think you can, interest is like most words polysemous. You can, it's like healthy. I mean, people are healthy, food is healthy, a run can be healthy. But there is a kind of focus or focal meaning. I think in the focal sense, people are healthy and a run is healthy because it promotes health in people. Food is healthy because eating it promotes health in people. So an interesting book is, I think, a book which answers to interests of people, which is a kind of interest attention sponge, yeah, which has properties which regularly activate interest in people. So I think the focal meaning of interest is one in which interest is a dispositional state of a thinker. And then from there you can build bridges to the kind of meanings where you say there's an interesting book or interesting remark today, interesting talk, yeah. But so that would be my story. But because you can build these bridges and there are interesting things in the world, the story I've been trying to tell gets some more traction, because if you take an example of where people say, "Oh no, I don't think that holes like that exist," it's usually always the hole of the Eiffel Tower on my left shoe. Yeah, I mean, there might be a situation in which you get some interest in these things together. Yeah, namely in philosophical discussions where I just point this out to you. But it's not like people, for instance. I mean, people are on the face of it, common sense are complex things, and they are attention sponges. Yeah, they command our attention. We take interest in them. We take regularly interest in them, and so on and so forth. And because of that, we regularly attend to these things, these parts together. Therefore, they appear to us as natural unities. So that would be my story. Yeah? Interest, the word, English word interest, or any similar word, is polysemous. It has a central meaning where it concerns dispositions which may be activated in different situations. The fact that it has this meaning where it applies to objects shows there are some objects which regularly activate such dispositions, and therefore merit to be called interesting. And that helps my story a bit. So I tried to get something constructive out of that, and that was hopefully helpful.
But the attention is the cause of the unity, or the thing is already a unity when I direct my attention to it?
It's not a unity when you direct your attention to it. There are no unities in the natural world. Yeah, if you go with a strong, there's a strong reading of the view, but there are relations between it, relations between different parts, and things standing in these relations. They might attract your interest. When they attract your interest, rightly or wrongly, you attend to them, and then they appear to you as a unity. Yeah, the crucial idea is appearing as a unity, and that's different from composing things into a unity. Is that
Okay.
if not, continue to?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
So we have time for one more question, perhaps. Does anyone have any more questions? Okay. So I think that's it for today. I would like to thank Professor. Yeah, thank you, Professor Mark Textor, for the interesting presentation. Thank you, Professor André Leclerc, for the comments. I would also like to thank Professor Peter Simons and Thomas Übel for participating, and those of you who are in YouTube and on our audience. So, as I said yesterday, throughout the event, we're only broadcasting the morning sessions, but not the afternoon and evening sessions. So, in the afternoon today, we'll have a presentation given by Professor Gabriel Ferreira from Unicinos, and Professor André Porto, who is professor at Universidade de Goiás, Federal de Goiás. And for those of you who are just joining in YouTube, we'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. UTC -3. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.